This interesting video, China released 1 million rabbits into the desert. What happened next shocked the world.
It started as a rumor, 1 million rabbits released into the Chinese desert like a living tide of fur and hope. To many, it sounded insane. How could soft, fragile creatures survive in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, let alone heal it? Yet what began as a desperate ecological gamble would soon defy every prediction. Because in the endless sands of northern China, something miraculous began to grow. The reason? Cute little rabbits. The project almost no one believed. At the edge of Inner Mongolia's Dalad Banner, the wind never seemed to rest. It carried with it a constant haze of sand that blurred the horizon and swallowed entire villages over time. The ground was cracked, brittle, and yellow, a color that locals had come to associate with loss. For decades, this region, once grassland, had been retreating under the advance of the desert. Crops failed, rivers shrank, and families left in search of greener provinces. It was here, amid the endless dunes and dust, that one of China's strangest ecological experiments took shape. The Dalad Banner is part of the vast Ordos Plateau, sitting on the southern edge of the Gobi Desert, a frontier that has long been a battleground in China's fight against desertification. By the early 2000s, the government estimated that desert land covered more than a quarter of the country's territory, threatening not only livelihoods, but also the stability of ecosystems and urban centers downwind. Dust storms that originated in Inner Mongolia often swept across Beijing and even drifted as far as Japan and Korea. Stopping the desert's march became a national priority.
For the 3 North Shelter Belt Forest Program, a large-scale afforestation project.
The goal is to stop deserts from swallowing villages and farmland.
China had already launched the 3 North Shelter Belt program, known globally as the Great Green Wall, to plant billions of trees along the country's northern frontier. But in places like Dalad Banner, the soil was so degraded and the climate so harsh that even hardy saplings struggled to survive. The government began to fund local pilot projects that explored unconventional means of restoration. Among them was a proposal so unorthodox that it initially sounded more like a fable than a scientific plan: releasing rabbits into the desert. The idea emerged from a small team of ecologists working with local herders and agricultural experts. They argued that while trees could take years to take root, animals, particularly small, fast-reproducing herbivores, could help jumpstart the ecosystem by aerating soil, fertilizing it with droppings, and spreading native plant seeds. Rabbits, they reasoned, had the right mix of resilience and adaptability. In theory, they could survive on sparse vegetation, dig burrows that trapped moisture, and create conditions favorable for plant regrowth. It wasn't the first time China had looked to animals for environmental solutions. In other desert regions, officials had experimented with goats, camels, and even grazing sheep to manage vegetation and stabilize dunes. But rabbits, light-footed, prolific, and often considered pests elsewhere, were a gamble. The plan called for the controlled release of roughly 1 million rabbits, bred in local facilities and introduced gradually over several months across fenced experimental zones in Dalad Banner. When news of the project broke, it divided the scientific community. Some saw it as an innovative approach to biological engineering, a living tool to restore balance where machinery and manpower had failed. Others feared it would repeat the mistakes of the Australian rabbit crisis, where imported European rabbits had devastated local ecosystems and agriculture. Chinese social media buzzed with disbelief. "They're turning the desert into a bunny farm?" one commenter wrote on Weibo. "Have we learned nothing from history?" Yet for the researchers on the ground, the project wasn't reckless. It was meticulously controlled. Each release area was enclosed by kilometers of fencing to prevent overexpansion. Monitoring teams documented vegetation recovery, soil composition, and population numbers. Artificial burrows were dug to protect the animals from extreme temperatures, and small water stations were installed using solar-powered pumps. The goal wasn't to let rabbits run wild, but to see whether they could coexist with native desert plants and contribute to soil regeneration. The first release took place in the spring, when the sun was still soft on the dunes. Local officials, scientists, and a handful of journalists gathered to witness the event. Crates were opened, and hundreds of rabbits darted across the sand, timid at first, then bounding freely as if testing their new home. They looked out of place, one observer recalled, but also strangely determined. The first few weeks were uncertain. Some rabbits succumbed to predators like hawks and foxes. Others struggled to find enough food. But those that survived began digging, creating networks of burrows that reshaped the dunes' surface. Their digging loosened the compacted crust of the desert, allowing air and moisture to penetrate. Their droppings, rich in nitrogen, began to feed the thin soil. Soon after, patches of hardy grasses, mostly Artemisia and Salix species, began sprouting around the burrow clusters. By late summer, satellite imagery detected faint traces of green spreading across parts of Dalad Banner where there had been none before. It wasn't a lush meadow, but it was proof that life could return. Scientists documented an increase in soil humidity and microbial activity, key indicators of ecological recovery. Local herders, once skeptical, began to notice fewer dust storms and slightly cooler ground temperatures near the experimental zones. Chinese state media cautiously praised the initiative, calling it a new chapter in desert control. Internationally, reactions ranged from fascination to mockery. China's bunny army to fight the desert, one Western headline quipped, but behind the humor was genuine curiosity. Could such a small creature truly shift the balance of an entire ecosystem? For the people of Dalad Banner, the answer was personal. The desert was not just a scientific problem, it was their home. Generations had watched their grasslands turn to sand, forcing them to abandon herding traditions. The Rabbit Project, even in its early stages, represented something bigger, a sense of possibility. If the desert could grow green again, even in small patches, then maybe the tide could finally turn. By the end of the first year, the project team announced its preliminary findings. Soil organic matter had increased by nearly 15% in certain areas. Native plant coverage had doubled, and small birds had begun to nest near the burrow networks. The rabbits themselves remained under close observation, with population controls in place to prevent overbreeding. Far from the ecological disaster some predicted, the experiment was cautiously deemed a success. Dalad Banner's rabbit release became a symbol of ingenuity, proof that ecological recovery could come from unexpected places. It didn't erase decades of desertification overnight, but it sparked a new conversation about how humanity could work with, rather than against, nature's smallest engineers. What began as a wild idea was now being studied as a potential model for future restoration projects across northern China. In the heart of Inner Mongolia, amid dunes that once seemed eternal, the desert had begun to stir again. And at the center of that change were 1 million rabbits, unassuming, underestimated, and quietly rewriting the story of the land. But what happened next would silence the skeptics because within a single season, those rabbits did something no one thought possible. They began to change the desert itself. The process, from experiment to ecological miracle. The transformation of Dalad Banner didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, in the rustle of wind over newly loosened sand, in the faint green shimmer of grass, daring to return where none had grown for decades. What had started as a modest scientific trial was now evolving into one of the most closely observed ecological phenomena in modern China. In the early weeks after the release, the monitoring stations dotted across the desert worked around the clock. Researchers recorded everything: burrow patterns, feeding behavior, soil moisture, and vegetation growth. Drones hovered over the dunes, capturing images of rabbits darting between patches of hardy shrubs. At first, the data looked unremarkable: limited movement, sporadic feeding, and high mortality due to heat and predators. The desert was a merciless place, and survival was never guaranteed. But by midsummer, patterns began to emerge. The surviving rabbit populations clustered near shaded depressions and dried riverbeds, where underground moisture lingered. There, they started digging, instinctively, relentlessly, creating networks of tunnels and small mounds. These burrows didn't just shelter the animals, they became microhabitats. When it rained, even slightly, water pooled in the dugouts instead of vanishing instantly into the sand. Seeds blown by the wind found refuge in these damp pockets, germinating faster than usual. The rabbits' feeding habits also played an unexpected role. Instead of stripping vegetation bare, as some critics had feared, their moderate grazing encouraged regrowth. By nipping the tops of young shoots, they stimulated plants to spread horizontally, covering more ground and stabilizing the soil. Their droppings, rich in nitrogen and organic matter, acted as a natural fertilizer, small but continuous doses that nurtured the fragile ecosystem. By the second phase of the project, scientists were seeing clear indicators of change. Soil samples revealed rising levels of microbial activity, a crucial factor in rebuilding fertility. The topsoil, once lifeless, began to retain moisture longer. The local temperature near burrow clusters dropped by nearly 1 degree Celsius compared to surrounding barren zones, a subtle yet significant sign of the desert's cooling. Satellite data told the same story. Patches of green, initially just specks, began to connect like dots in a vast mosaic. Within a year, vegetation coverage in the pilot zones increased by more than 20%. Dune stabilization followed naturally. Where plants grew, the sand no longer drifted as easily. The sight astonished even veteran ecologists. The desert is learning to breathe again, one researcher from Inner Mongolia University remarked. Still, the project was not without setbacks. Predators, including foxes and eagles, began to follow the rabbit's trail, drawn by the sudden abundance of prey. To maintain balance, the project team avoided interfering too much, choosing instead to let natural predator-prey dynamics unfold. This decision, though risky, proved wise. The predators helped keep the rabbit population under control, preventing overgrazing. Within months, Dalad Banner was witnessing a miniature ecosystem rebuilding itself, one layer at a time. Local herders who had once watched their land vanish were among the first to notice the difference.
Have you ever seen a desert turn green again? Imagine endless sand for miles, no trees. Now imagine that same land covered with millions of trees.
The sandstorms are weaker now, said a villager named Bao, who had lived on the desert's edge for over 30 years. There's more grass for the sheep, and the air doesn't sting as much. For communities long resigned to migration or poverty, even modest recovery felt revolutionary. Some residents were recruited to assist in monitoring the project, building fences, and maintaining solar-powered water stations. The initiative was not just ecological, it was social, giving people a renewed connection to the land. The government's response was swift. Encouraged by the data from Dalad Banner, provincial authorities expanded the experiment across several nearby regions, including parts of the Kubuki Desert, another hotspot for desertification. The National Forestry and Grassland Administration labeled the project a controlled ecological success, integrating it into China's broader desert reversal campaign. Funding increased, and new teams were dispatched to refine the technique, adjusting release numbers, improving burrow designs, and testing combinations of native plant species that could best coexist with the rabbits. Internationally, scientists began taking notice. Environmental publications described it as a soft engineering approach, leveraging natural animal behavior to achieve environmental goals. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, cited Dalad Banner as an example of innovative restoration strategy, blending traditional land wisdom with biological solutions. In a world where billion-dollar technologies often dominated climate discussions, China's rabbit experiment seemed almost poetic in its simplicity. Behind the headlines, the science was meticulous. Each rabbit colony was GPS tracked and logged. Field researchers collected thousands of soil and vegetation samples, comparing them to control sites untouched by the project. The results were consistent: higher organic carbon levels, better root density, and improved water retention. These micro-changes rippled outward, attracting insects, beetles, ants, and pollinators, which in turn lured small birds. Within 3 years, the once barren pilot zones supported a surprising variety of life. But the most striking change was visual. Dunes that once looked lifeless began to blush with pale green in spring, deepening into emerald as summer came. Tufts of grass swayed between burrow entrances, forming small meadows. The transformation was modest in size compared to China's vast deserts, but symbolically, it was immense. The Dalad Banner project had proven that recovery didn't always require massive reforestation campaigns or expensive technology. Sometimes, it began with a small animal and a big idea. The project's success also changed the mindset of local policymakers. Instead of imposing uniform restoration models, they started encouraging region-specific approaches, what scientists called localized biological adaptation. For Dalad Banner, that meant continuing to rely on rabbits as ecosystem engineers, supplemented by native shrubs and microbial soil treatments. For other arid zones, it opened the door to different animals or natural agents suited to local conditions. Even the skeptics had to admit the results were undeniable. While concerns about overpopulation lingered, the project's strict monitoring and enclosure methods kept the balance stable. The rabbits never spilled beyond designated areas, and their numbers were periodically adjusted to match vegetation density. It was a stark contrast to the uncontrolled spread that had once devastated parts of Australia. By its 5th year, the Dalad Banner experiment was no longer just a curiosity. It was a model. Government reports highlighted it as part of a new generation of ecological engineering projects aimed at restoring China's degraded lands by 2035. Visitors, scientists, journalists, and environmentalists began traveling to Inner Mongolia to witness what they called the living laboratory in the sand. From the air, Dalad Banner looked transformed. The sharp contrast between yellow and green had softened, replaced by a patchwork of life. For the researchers who had once been ridiculed for their rabbit dream, it was vindication, proof that nature, when given the smallest chance, could heal itself in ways humanity barely understood. And at the heart of it all were the rabbits, burrowing, grazing, multiplying, doing quietly what no machine ever could. But as the dunes began to bloom and the skeptics fell silent, one question lingered in every scientific circle. Why rabbits, and not any other creature, were chosen to shoulder the weight of China's desert dream? Why rabbits? The logic behind the choice. When news of the Dalad Banner experiment first spread, the world was puzzled. Why rabbits? Why not goats, camels, or even hardy rodents better suited for desert life? To many, the choice seemed absurd. a soft, fragile animal placed against one of the harshest environments on Earth. But behind what looked like a whimsical decision lay years of ecological reasoning, historical lessons, and scientific precision. The choice began with biology. Rabbits, particularly the species bred for the Dalad Banner Project, are prolific survivors. They reproduce rapidly, with gestation periods of less than a month and litters of up to 8. In ecosystems where the goal is to restore balance and productivity quickly, their population dynamics make them ideal catalysts. While this characteristic has caused havoc in uncontrolled settings like Australia, China's experiment was designed to keep reproduction in check through strict enclosure zones and predator balance. The very trait that once turned rabbits into pests elsewhere became an advantage in a managed environment. Beyond their numbers, rabbits possess an ability few other animals share. They are natural soil engineers. Their constant digging, a behavior rooted in the instinct to build burrows, loosens compacted soil and increases aeration, allowing moisture and nutrients to penetrate deeper layers. In the parched sands of Inner Mongolia, this was revolutionary. Traditional mechanical tilling often failed in such brittle terrain, but the rabbits accomplished the same task naturally, with thousands of tiny paws and endless persistence. Moreover, their droppings proved to be miniature powerhouses of fertility. Rabbit waste decomposes quickly and is rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, two nutrients critical for plant growth. Unlike larger grazing animals that trample young shoots and compact the soil, rabbits disperse organic matter gently and evenly. Over time, this created pockets of microfertility around their burrows, nurturing native desert flora like Artemisia ordosica and Caragana korshinsky. These plants, in turn, stabilized dunes and expanded their root systems, creating the foundation for a self-sustaining ecosystem. From an economic standpoint, rabbits also offered unique benefits. They required minimal maintenance, survived on sparse vegetation, and could be bred locally without expensive imports. For impoverished desert communities, they represented both a source of livelihood and ecological recovery. Some of the rabbits used in the project were part of dual-purpose programs. Their offspring could be used for meat or fur under controlled breeding conditions, providing income while maintaining population balance. This dual role made the experiment not only scientifically sound, but socially sustainable. Culturally, there was another layer to the choice. In Chinese folklore, the rabbit, or yutu, the jade rabbit, is a symbol of renewal and resilience, living on the moon and mixing the elixir of life. For many involved in the project, the symbolism resonated deeply. They saw in the rabbits not just animals, but emblems of rebirth, small carriers of life, returning to a land long thought dead. What began as an ecological plan took on a quiet, almost poetic significance. Still, skeptics questioned whether rabbits were the right tool. History's warning signs were clear. In the 19th century, when European settlers introduced rabbits to Australia, they multiplied uncontrollably, devastating crops and displacing native species. That catastrophe became one of the most infamous ecological lessons of all time. But China's scientists had studied that very history meticulously. The Dalad Banner Project was built on control and containment. Every release zone was fenced, every colony tracked, and every ecological shift measured. Unlike Australia's open plains, Inner Mongolia's enclosures were monitored by teams equipped with drones and infrared cameras to prevent escapes and maintain population ratios. Other animals had been considered: goats for grazing, camels for hardiness, and rodents for burrowing. But each had a fatal flaw. Goats, though tough, strip vegetation to the roots, accelerating erosion. Camels, too large and slow-breeding, could not affect the soil structure meaningfully. Rodents, though useful diggers, lack the social and reproductive structure that rabbits have, making them unpredictable for sustained restoration. Rabbits struck the rare balance between being small enough to manage, fertile enough to multiply, and active enough to reshape the terrain. There was also a behavioral factor often overlooked in the public debate. Rabbits are creatures of habit. Once they establish a warren, they tend to remain within a fixed territory. This territorial nature made them perfect for controlled ecosystems like Dalad Banner's fenced zones.
Every rabbit becomes a tiny ecosystem engineer, turning sand into fertile humus and even planting seeds with every drop of fertilizer.
They didn't wander endlessly like larger grazers. Instead, they focused their activity in contained areas, deepening the soil's fertility over time. Over the years, the data vindicated the choice. Comparative studies showed that rabbit-populated areas experienced nearly double the rate of soil recovery compared to mechanically treated zones. Vegetation density rose faster, and biodiversity increased more broadly. Even species that had vanished from the region, larks, sand grouse, and desert hares, began to return, drawn by the revived food web. What surprised scientists most wasn't just the rabbits' survival, but their adaptation. Some began altering their burrowing habits to dig deeper than their domestic counterparts, reaching cooler layers of sand. Others changed feeding patterns, consuming tougher desert grasses rather than imported forage. Over time, the population began showing signs of microevolution, a subtle but fascinating indication that nature was adjusting to its own restoration. By the project's third year, few doubted the wisdom of the original choice. The rabbits had done what machines and human labor could not. They brought back balance. They didn't just survive the desert, they became part of it. Still, the project sparked a larger discussion in ecological circles. Was the Dalad Banner experiment a one-time anomaly? Or could this rabbit model be replicated elsewhere? Environmentalists across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East began to ask whether similar biological engineering could work in their own degraded lands. And soon, China's bold gamble would spark a wave of imitators and admirers around the world. What countries copied this wise move? Beyond China, other nations tried similar experiments. China's success in Dalad Banner didn't stay within its borders for long. As news of the rabbit experiment spread across scientific journals and environmental conferences, countries facing similar struggles with desertification began to take notice. The idea that small animals, not machines or chemicals, could revive broken land fascinated ecologists worldwide. And soon, several nations began experimenting with their own versions of biological restoration, each adapting the principle to local conditions. In Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, desertification has long threatened fragile ecosystems and ancient agricultural communities. Inspired by China's success, Egyptian researchers from the Desert Research Center launched small-scale trials using native rodents and desert hares to loosen compacted soil and improve seed dispersal. These animals were selected for their resilience to heat and scarcity of water. The results were modest but promising. In areas where rodents were allowed to burrow freely, soil moisture retention increased by nearly 12%. Native grasses like Stipagrostis ciliata and Panicum turgidum began to reappear. In the Western Sahara, Morocco and Algeria conducted parallel efforts, introducing small burrowing mammals into fenced restoration sites to reduce wind erosion. While these projects never reached the scale of Dalad Banner, they demonstrated that desert restoration could succeed without massive irrigation or heavy machinery. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the smallest interventions yield the largest transformations. If China's experiment was a triumph of control, Australia's story remains the cautionary counterpoint. In the mid-19th century, European settlers introduced 24 wild rabbits for hunting and companionship. Within decades, those few animals multiplied into hundreds of millions, ravaging crops, stripping grasslands bare, and triggering widespread erosion. Australia's struggle against its rabbit plague became one of the most infamous ecological disasters in history. By the 50s, desperate measures were taken, fences stretching thousands of kilometers, biological control using the myxoma virus, and later, the calicivirus. These methods temporarily reduced numbers, but the population rebounded repeatedly. Australia's landscape still bears the scars of that mistake. Collapsed soils, vanished plant species, and billions in agricultural losses. When China announced its Dalad Banner project, Australian ecologists were among the first to raise concerns. Rabbits don't rehabilitate deserts, one headline warned, they create them. But what made China's approach fundamentally different was control and containment. The Dalad Banner experiment operated within strictly monitored zones, balancing rabbit populations with natural predators and food supply, the very factors missing in Australia's uncontrolled spread. Ironically, Australia's painful history provided the blueprint for how not to repeat the same disaster. Chinese scientists often cited it as the example that shaped their rigorous population protocols. Where Australia had chaos, Dalad Banner had data. Farther west, the United Arab Emirates approached desert restoration through a mix of modern technology and biological intervention. In the Liwa and Al Ain regions, government researchers experimented with small herbivores, primarily Arabian hares and desert gazelles, to maintain vegetation balance in newly established green corridors. These animals grazed selectively, preventing overgrowth while spreading native seeds through droppings. Combined with drip irrigation, windbreaks, and imported mycorrhizal fungi to enrich soil microbiomes, the UAE's project turned several patches of barren sand into thriving oases. Satellite imagery between 2010 and 2020 showed vegetation cover increasing by nearly 18% in certain areas. Although smaller in scale than China's initiative, the UAE experiment underscored the value of integrating biology with technology, letting nature work alongside science, not beneath it. South America, guinea pigs and hares in the high desert. On the other side of the world, in the Atacama-adjacent regions of Chile and southern Peru, scientists faced a similar challenge. Land so dry that even cacti struggled to thrive. Here, researchers from local universities tested the potential of guinea pigs and hares in arid land regeneration. Guinea pigs, known locally as cuyas, are traditional livestock in the Andes, valued for their hardiness and efficient metabolism. When introduced to controlled desert plots, their grazing patterns promoted low-level vegetation recovery by trimming fast-growing weeds and stimulating root branching. Meanwhile, hares, which dig shallow burrows and consume a wide variety of plants, helped aerate compacted ground. The experiments were small but insightful. Over several years, the Peruvian and Chilean teams found that combining animal activity with native plant seeding led to measurable improvements in soil structure and reduced surface crusting. Like Dalad Banner, their approach emphasized balance, using animals as partners in restoration, not tools to be unleashed without supervision. What these global efforts revealed was a fundamental truth about ecological engineering. Scale and control determine destiny. The same biological traits that made rabbits heroes in China, rapid reproduction, burrowing, and grazing, could spell disaster if left unchecked. Successful restoration demanded precision, constant monitoring, and humility before nature's unpredictability. China's model worked because it was never about domination. It was about partnership. Every burrow dug, every plant sprouting beside a rabbit's warren, was part of a carefully measured dialogue between humans and nature. Other nations, inspired yet cautious, began to adopt this mindset, a shift from imposing solutions to collaborating with ecosystems. In a world grappling with climate change and land degradation, the Dalad Banner experiment became a quiet inspiration. It reminded scientists and policymakers that healing the Earth might not always require monumental interventions. Sometimes, it begins with the smallest creatures, and the wisdom to let them do what they've done for millions of years. As the world took notes and deserts began to whisper with new life, one question still loomed over Dalad Banner. What lasting legacy did those million rabbits leave behind? And what does their story mean for the planet's future? Today, years after the first rabbits set their paws on the sands of Dalad Banner, the desert tells a different story, one of cautious hope. Satellite images reveal stretches of green threading across what was once lifeless terrain. Native grasses and shrubs have returned, anchoring the soil and softening the wind's bite. For many environmental scientists, it stands as proof that restoration doesn't always require vast budgets or towering machines. Sometimes, it begins with an idea that seems almost absurd. The Dalad Banner experiment changed how the world viewed biological engineering. It showed that even fragile ecosystems could heal if humans worked with nature's rhythms instead of against them. But it also left behind a warning: balance is everything. A project that revives life can just as easily destroy it if control slips. China's rabbit miracle remains both an inspiration and a lesson, a reminder that the fight against desertification won't be won through domination, but through partnership. In every burrow dug and every blade of grass reborn, there's a quiet truth. Sometimes, the smallest creatures can spark the world's biggest recoveries. From a million rabbits in the desert to a million lessons for the planet, Dalad Banner proved that healing the Earth begins with humility and hope. Stay curious and subscribe for more incredible stories where nature and innovation collide.